It seems to me coal miners sing. Some, I don't know, there's areas, and there's areas in the United States that a lot of music, West Texas in particular, I don't know, they're not miners there, but there's something little there. Pocket of music.
Could be in the water.
No telling us what it would be, but Kentucky had Merle Travis. Mose Regger's famous from there. But he would go back, and we would go to these small towns, and the guitar would be there. And we'd pass the guitar to this fellow, and he'd sing a while and pass it over. And that was just constant.
They were the voices of an era. Don and Phil Everly, known simply as the Everly Brothers, seemed untouchable. With their flawless harmonies and heartfelt lyrics, they rose out of Kentucky to redefine what rock and roll could sound like. Songs like Bye Bye Love and All I Have to Do Is Dream weren't just hits. They became cultural milestones, forever etched into the fabric of American music. Their influence stretched far beyond their own chart success. The Beatles admitted they modeled their early harmonies after the Everlys, while Simon and Garfunkel often credited them as the very blueprint of their sound. On stage, the brothers were inseparable, their voices blending so seamlessly that audiences believed they must have been two halves of one soul. But behind those harmonies, a darker truth was unfolding. While fans saw smiling faces and perfect synchronization, the brothers were hiding fractures that no one dared to speak about. Childhood rivalries, substance abuse, money disputes, and creative battles were quietly eroding the foundation of their relationship. And in time, the facade would collapse in spectacular fashion. The Everly Brothers gave the world perfect harmony, but their own lives were anything but harmonious. This is the dark truth about their breakup. Before they were icons, Don and Phil Everly were simply two boys growing up in a musical family in Kentucky. Their father, Ike Everly, was a respected guitarist who had carved out a career in radio, and their mother, Margaret, nurtured their talents from the very beginning. Music wasn't just entertainment in the Everly household, it was discipline, expectation, and identity. The brothers first learned to harmonize on their parents' laps, blending voices before they could even write their own names. By the time they were teenagers, they were already performing live on the Everly family's radio show, rehearsing endlessly under their father's sharp eye. To the outside world, this looked like the perfect training ground for greatness. But inside, the constant comparisons began to sting. Don, the elder brother by 2 years, was naturally gifted in songwriting and arranging, often taking the lead. Phil, meanwhile, possessed a higher, angelic voice that complemented Don's deeper tones. Together, they were unstoppable. Apart, however, Phil sometimes felt overshadowed, as though his role was secondary to Don's leadership. The truth is, sibling rivalry is natural in any household, but in the Everly home, it was magnified by the demands of performance. If one of them hit a wrong note, the other would know instantly. If one made a mistake, it was felt by both. Their father, while proud, expected perfection, and this pressure pushed the boys to constantly outdo each other. And while fans would later marvel at their seamless vocal blend, that harmony was built on years of silent competition. As the 1950s dawned, Don and Phil began to step into the national spotlight. Chet Atkins, one of Nashville's greatest guitarists, helped introduce them to the music industry. But even in those early days, cracks were beginning to form. Don started to develop ambitions as a songwriter, penning lyrics that revealed both his talent and his desire for independence. Phil, on the other hand, wanted to keep the partnership balanced, worried that Don's growing dominance would eventually leave him in the shadows. These fears were never spoken aloud, but they lingered beneath every performance, every rehearsal, and every interview. What no one could see then was that the seeds of their eventual downfall had already been planted. The same family environment that gave them their remarkable gift also forged a competitive streak that would one day explode into bitterness. The Everly Brothers weren't just learning to sing together. They were learning to live with tension that could only be hidden for so long. The Everly Brothers' rise to stardom was nothing short of meteoric. By the late 1950s, Don and Phil were household names, selling millions of records and redefining popular music with their harmonies. Songs like Wake Up Little Susie, Kathy's Clown, and All I Have to Do Is Dream dominated the charts, and teenage fans screamed their names as if they were royalty. To the world, they were the perfect American success story. Two clean-cut brothers whose angelic harmonies captured innocence and longing in equal measure. But behind the curtain, their relationship was already beginning to show dangerous cracks. Fame magnifies everything: the adoration, the pressure, and the demons hiding within. Don, the elder brother and the more restless of the two, began to struggle with substance abuse. Pills, alcohol, and the grueling pace of constant touring left him unstable, moody, and unpredictable. Phil, on the other hand, tried to maintain the image of professionalism, but he often found himself carrying the weight when Don faltered. On stage, the harmony was flawless. Off stage, the silences between them grew colder. The demand for constant perfection only made things worse. Record labels and managers pushed them relentlessly, demanding hit after hit, tour after tour, and smiling photo shoots no matter how deep the exhaustion ran. In interviews, they had to play the role of happy brothers united by music. But behind closed doors, arguments erupted over everything from set lists to creative control. Don felt trapped, wanting to stretch into more experimental songwriting, while Phil leaned toward preserving the classic sound that made them famous. That push and pull, never openly resolved, only widened the gulf between them. Add to this the constant comparisons. Critics speculated endlessly about which brother was more talented. Fans debated who sang lead better, and even their families noticed the imbalance. Don, often seen as the visionary, resented being chained to a duo when he dreamed of independence. Phil, forever the younger brother, carried quiet frustration at always being cast as second fiddle. And while audiences saw only smiles and harmony, the truth was darker. The pressure of fame was amplifying insecurities that had begun in childhood. By the early 1960s, the cracks were no longer invisible. They were widening. And soon, the business of music, money, contracts, and betrayal would pour gasoline on a fire already burning between them. As the Everly Brothers' fame soared, so did the complications of the business that surrounded them. At first, they were just grateful boys from Kentucky, thrilled that the world was finally listening. But success came with contracts, managers, and publishers who often cared more about profits than brotherhood. In 1960, the Everlys signed a lucrative deal with Warner Brothers Records, which brought them enormous commercial opportunities, but also locked them into obligations that would weigh heavily on their relationship. On paper, it looked like a golden opportunity. In reality, it became a source of endless battles. One of the biggest early fractures came from their feud with their music publisher, Acuff Rose. The brothers had written some of their own material, but disputes over royalties and ownership meant they didn't always control the very songs that made them famous. Don, the more ambitious songwriter, felt cheated when others profited from his creativity. Phil, who depended more on performance than writing, grew frustrated with the endless meetings and legal wrangling. Instead of uniting against the system, they turned on each other. Money quickly became ammunition in their fights. Who was owed more? Who carried the group creatively? whose decisions were costing them financially. These weren't just business questions. They cut into their pride as brothers. Every royalty check and every contract became a silent reminder of imbalance. Don resented Phil's reliance on the Everly brand, while Phil quietly resented Don's attempts to control their direction. Managers, record executives, and lawyers circled them constantly, each with their own agenda, and often played one brother against the other. The strain only grew worse when their popularity began to dip in the mid-1960s, as the British invasion swept America. The Beatles, ironically inspired by the Everlys, now eclipsed them on the charts. To recapture their magic, the brothers were pressured into endless touring schedules, but the financial pressures only deepened their exhaustion. Don, slipping further into substance abuse, grew reckless. Phil, feeling the weight of responsibility, became bitter. The money that was supposed to cement their success instead widened the gulf between them. By the early 1970s, the tension over contracts, earnings, and publishing rights had eroded whatever trust remained. The world still saw them as flawless harmonizers, but privately, they were little more than business partners trapped in a cage of obligations. And soon, that cage would shatter in a very public way. By the late 1960s, the Everly brothers were no longer just battling contracts and managers. They were battling each other over the very heart of their music. What had once been a natural partnership was now a constant tug-of-war over direction, identity, and control. Don, always restless and ambitious, wanted to evolve. He admired the experimental soundscapes of the Beatles and Bob Dylan, and longed to break away from the formula that had once made them household names. He was writing darker, more introspective songs, material that leaned toward the personal and the poetic rather than the polished, radio-friendly sound of their early years. Phil, on the other hand, believed in tradition. His pure, soaring voice had built their reputation on innocence and harmony, and he wanted to preserve that. To Phil, their classic style wasn't just nostalgia, it was their identity, the very thing fans still craved. He feared that Don's obsession with reinvention would alienate the audiences who adored them. This difference in vision created a creative battlefield. Recording sessions often descended into arguments, with Don pushing for edgier arrangements, while Phil insisted on staying true to their roots. Even the songs they chose revealed the rift. Don gravitated toward material with bite and grit, while Phil leaned toward romantic ballads that highlighted melody over message. Neither brother could compromise, and the more they fought, the more their music began to suffer. Producers and musicians who worked with them described an icy tension in the studio, where the two barely spoke except to argue. What made it worse was that Don's songwriting dominance put him in the driver's seat creatively. His compositions were increasingly shaping the Everly sound, and Phil felt reduced to simply providing the harmony. For a man whose voice had carried half the weight of their legacy, this was humiliating. He began to feel like a supporting act in a group that was supposed to be equal. Don, meanwhile, felt shackled by the very partnership that had made him famous. He wanted freedom, individuality, and recognition as a serious artist outside of the Everly Brothers brand. To him, Phil's resistance was a chain around his neck, pulling him back into a past he was desperate to outgrow. Their personal relationship, already strained, began to unravel completely. Offstage, they spoke less and less. On stage, they still delivered flawless performances, but the warmth was gone. The Everly Brothers became less about shared joy and more about obligation. Each show was a truce, each harmony a fragile performance that hid the anger just beneath the surface. By the early 1970s, their creative tug-of-war had reached breaking point. Don and Phil were no longer just brothers. They were rivals trapped in the same cage. And soon, that cage would explode in front of thousands of people. The breaking point came on a hot summer night in 1973 at Knott's Berry Farm in California, where the Everly Brothers were scheduled to perform for thousands of fans. To the audience, it was supposed to be another nostalgic evening of golden hits. Two brothers, side by side, blending their voices in the way only they could. But backstage, the atmosphere was toxic. Years of bitterness, resentment, and unspoken anger were about to erupt. Don, struggling with substance abuse and weighed down by exhaustion, walked on stage visibly under the influence. His voice cracked, his timing faltered, and the polished professionalism that had defined the Everlys for nearly 2 decades was unraveling in front of an audience that had paid to see perfection. Phil, who had long carried the burden of Don's erratic behavior, was humiliated. He had tolerated the tension, the arguments, and even Don's dominance in the studio, but now, here in front of thousands, it was too much. As the show stumbled forward, Don's slurred delivery made it almost impossible to keep the performance together. The harmonies that once sounded like heaven now teetered on collapse. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing that something was very wrong. Then came the moment that sealed the Everly Brothers' fate. In the middle of the performance, furious at Don's condition and fed up with years of personal and professional frustration, Phil took his guitar, smashed it against the stage floor, and stormed off. It wasn't just a dramatic exit. It was a symbolic act, a final statement that the partnership was over. The audience sat stunned. Don, left alone under the stage lights, reportedly muttered bitterly into the microphone, "The Everly Brothers died 10 years ago." It was a chilling remark, but in many ways, it was true. The harmony had ended long before that night. It had just taken a public implosion to reveal the depth of their collapse. For fans, it was a shocking betrayal. These were the brothers who had once embodied unity, their voices so intertwined that they seemed inseparable. Now, they were tearing themselves apart on stage, their personal war laid bare for all to see. After that night, the Everly Brothers went their separate ways. Contracts were canceled, tours dissolved, and the dream was shattered. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Don and Phil Everly were no longer a duo. They did not speak to each other, did not attempt reconciliation, and refused to share the same stage again for more than a decade. What was once hailed as the greatest sibling act in music history had crumbled into silence. Don continued to wrestle with his addictions, while Phil attempted to carve out a solo career that never reached the same heights. Their names, once always spoken together, now existed in isolation. The 1973 Knott's Berry Farm concert became infamous in music history, not just as a breakup, but as a cautionary tale. It was proof that even the tightest harmonies could be undone by dissonance that runs too deep. For the Everly Brothers, that night was not just the end of a tour or a partnership. It was the funeral of their legacy as a united front. They had given the world beauty, but behind the microphones, they had been broken for years. That night, the mask fell. The Everly Brothers, as the world knew them, were gone. In the aftermath of the Knott's Berry Farm meltdown, the Everly Brothers drifted into a silence that was as deafening as their harmonies had once been sweet. For over a decade, Don and Phil barely spoke. To the outside world, their breakup was chalked up to artistic differences or exhaustion, but the truth ran far deeper. The wounds from years of rivalry, resentment, and that humiliating public implosion were so raw that neither brother could bring himself to forgive the other. Each went his own way, trying to forge an identity outside the Everly Brothers brand. Don, still plagued by addiction, sank into a cycle of instability. He attempted a solo career, releasing records that revealed his creative restlessness. But without Phil's balancing voice, the magic was gone. His personal life was chaotic, marked by failed relationships, health struggles, and the constant shadow of what had been lost. Don wanted freedom from the Everly name, but found that without it, he was just another man chasing recognition in a crowded field. Phil, on the other hand, tried to build a solo career of his own. He released a handful of albums and pursued projects in both music and television. But like Don, he could never escape the comparison to what he had once been part of. No matter how much he tried, Phil could not separate himself from the identity of being one half of the Everly Brothers. Every stage he stepped on, every microphone he approached, came with the unspoken reminder that audiences wanted the harmonies that no longer existed. The silence between them was not just physical, it was emotional. Holidays passed without contact. Years went by without reconciliation, and even when opportunities for collaboration arose, the bitterness kept them apart. Friends and industry peers described the brothers as locked in a Cold War, where neither side was willing to make the first move toward peace. For fans, it was heartbreaking. They had grown up with Don and Phil's voices intertwined like a single instrument, and now, the very thing that defined them seemed destined to fade away. The radio still played Kathy's Clown and All I Have to Do Is Dream, but in real life, those harmonies were silenced by pride, pain, and regret. The 1970s slipped into the early 1980s, and still, there was no sign of reconciliation. The Everly Brothers' story, it seemed, had ended not with a farewell tour or graceful retirement, but with silence and distance. The perfect harmony that once defined them was now only a memory. But time, as it often does, would eventually push them back together, though not without scars that could never truly heal. After more than a decade of silence, something remarkable happened. In 1983, Don and Phil Everly agreed to reunite for a concert at London's Royal Albert Hall. For fans who had waited years to see their idols together again, it was nothing short of a miracle. The tickets sold out instantly, and the air inside the hall that night was thick with anticipation. When the brothers stepped onto the stage, dressed sharply and standing side by side once more, the crowd erupted. And as soon as they opened their mouths to sing, the magic returned. Their voices, though weathered by time and struggle, still blended with the same haunting perfection that had captivated the world decades earlier. It was as if the years of bitterness had melted away, if only for a moment. But behind the scenes, the reality was more complicated. The reunion was not born out of reconciliation so much as necessity. Financial struggles, dwindling solo careers, and the persistent demand from fans had pushed them back together. They smiled for the cameras, they embraced for the crowds, but in private, the old wounds remained. Those who worked with them during this period recalled that the tension was never far below the surface. Don and Phil rarely spoke outside of rehearsals or performances. They were professional, yes, but brotherly warmth was absent. The decades of rivalry, the scars of betrayal, and the bitterness of their public split could not be erased by applause alone. Still, the reunion had its triumphs. The Albert Hall concert was hailed as a triumph, breathing new life into their careers. They recorded new material, went back on tour, and reintroduced their timeless harmonies to a generation that had never seen them live. Audiences were enchanted, critics praised their resilience, and for a time, it seemed the Everly Brothers might have finally found peace. Yet even in these later years, the cracks showed. Interviews were awkward, their body language stiff, and it was clear that the relationship was more business than brotherhood. Don continued to battle his inner demons, and Phil often seemed resigned to the fact that the partnership was something he could never fully escape, even if he wanted to. Their voices were united, but their hearts were not. The reunion gave fans closure, but it never truly healed the divide between Don and Phil. The harmonies that had once symbolized unity now felt like a fragile truce, a performance that kept their legacy alive but did little to restore their bond as brothers. They could stand on the same stage again, but the gulf between them remained, invisible yet undeniable. And as the years went on, that uneasy truce would become the final chapter of their story. The Everly Brothers' story ended not with reconciliation, but with a fragile truce that carried them into old age. In 2014, when Phil passed away at the age of 74, the world mourned the loss of one of the greatest voices in rock and roll. Don, left behind, spoke of his brother with a mixture of sorrow and regret, admitting that no matter how strained their relationship had been, Phil had been an inseparable part of his life. Their harmonies, once a symbol of perfection, had been forged in pain, rivalry, and sacrifice. And yet, despite the bitterness, despite the years of silence and conflict, their music endured. Generations who never witnessed the brothers' rise could still hear the magic in songs like All I Have to Do Is Dream and Kathy's Clown. Their influence lived on in the Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, and countless artists who followed. The tragedy of the Everly Brothers is that their greatest gift, the perfect blending of two voices, was also their greatest curse. They gave the world harmony, but could never find it themselves. Today, their legacy stands as both a triumph and a cautionary tale. Proof that even the sweetest music can come from broken places, and that sometimes the darkest truth hides behind the most beautiful sound.